This presentation has a look at some key principles around assessment in the classroom. Before we start, it's worth having a think for yourself. What do you think assessment is for? When do you think we should assess? And how do you think we should assess? Keep this in mind as we go through the presentation. You'll hear quite a lot about summative and formative assessment, so I'll start with explaining what summative assessment is. It would normally take place at the end of a very specific time period, so the end of a topic or course. It often takes the form of a test or exam, but it could also be something like project work if you think about subjects like drama or art, for example. It would normally involve some kind of grade or score, or even a qualification like a GCSE or an A-level. The key idea here is it's a measure of how students are performing at a particular point in time. Formative assessment is more about evaluating student understanding so that you can then inform your future planning. So the idea is that if you know where a student is at a certain point of your lesson, including the end, you can then use that information when you plan your next lesson. You can do it at any time, including in the middle of a lesson. It could be formal, like a test, or informal, such as asking questions. But the key idea is, have we got the learning to stick? And if not, what next? Or if we have, what next? I've put on here the Ross Morrison McGill book, Mark, Plan, Teach, because it's quite a good book for explaining how we think about our marking or our assessment informing our planning. Now give yourself a moment to read through these 4 examples and decide whether you think they are summative or formative. You will almost certainly hear about assessment for learning on this course as well. And it's a form of formative assessment, so it's a way of assessing where students are in order to inform our planning. It's informed by something called social constructivism. Now, constructivism is all about how we construct, if you like, our own realities. And social constructivism assumes that we construct our own realities from our experiences and interactions with others. So how we see the world, how we learn, is informed by the relationships we have with other people. It's highly influenced by a piece of work by Paul Black and Dylan William. It's called Inside the Black Box, a highly influential book, again one that you'll find in the library and school. It sees assessment and learning as being an integrated whole. It also talks about something called diagnostic assessment. This is identifying what a learner knows, which can be particularly useful if you want to know what difficulties or barriers they face, or if you want to identify any misconceptions. You'll sometimes see assessment for learning represented as a cycle, like the one on the right. I find it a little bit more useful to use the bullet points on the left. So we start with some kind of diagnostic assessment, so we know where our learners are now. The learning objectives of our lesson are where we are going, so having a really clear idea where we want to be at the end of 60 minutes. The lesson plan is what we write so that we know how we're going to get there. And then finally, assessment for learning is our way of working out whether or not we've been successful in that. I've included this diagram from Dylan William here on the right. It can look a little bit more confusing, but it is worth you pausing and spending a bit of time having a look at it. Here what he's saying is that clarifying, understanding and sharing learning intentions is really important for all parties, both the teacher and the learner. The teacher's job is then to engineer effective classroom discussions or tasks or activities, anything that we can do that elicits evidence of learning. And we get there by providing feedback that moves the learners forward. So we have our activities in mind, but we also need to know how we're going to check. How do we know if they've actually learned what we want them to learn? For then, activating students as learning resources for one another. This is this idea that we shouldn't forget that students can learn from each other, that they are a resource in the classroom. Some schools will use something called 3 before me, where they ask a student, rather than going straight to the teacher, to consider other resources in the classroom, including exercise books, textbooks, and the students sitting next to them. And then finally, number 5 is getting students to work as owners and agents of their own learning. So we want them to become independent and resilient. If we're thinking about getting students to be independent and resilient, then we also ought to have a look at metacognition and self-regulation. And I put a link here to a really useful page on the EEF website. What we want to think about here is that as teachers, we put in place interventions and share techniques and strategies with our students to enable them to complete tasks and learn. So for example, if I'm teaching children how to use equations in science, I will go through and model different techniques that they can use so they can do just that. So as well as me understanding how children can learn and be successful, I need to teach them that. So when we learn about cognition as teachers, we ought to think about the fact that students need to have that knowledge as well. They need to understand those mental processes involved in knowing, understanding and learning. If they have that information, then they can use it too. So metacognition is learning to learn. It's teaching our children how that learning process works. It should help build motivation, because if students know how their learning works, then they're much more willing to engage and use the skills that we've given them. Really, metacognition is about students understanding that if we give them a range of techniques and strategies that they can use to solve a problem or to learn, then they need to try those out. But if it doesn't work, not to give up, but to think about if there's a different technique or strategy they can use. If we can get them to do that, if we can get them to think about the processes they're using and be happy to move on to something different if they're getting stuck, then we've really got students able to learn well. So moving now from assessment to feedback, there's another link here to the EEF Teacher Toolkit, which tells us that high quality feedback gives us a really high impact. In fact, I think it's the second most impactful method after metacognition. What we need to do then to make sure our feedback is really effective is start with really high quality initial instruction. If we don't teach the children well, then it's really difficult for us to feedback if they go wrong. Is it their fault or ours? That sort of thing. We should make sure that our feedback is delivered at an appropriate time, so that we're always thinking that when we feedback, it's all about moving the students forward, looking at their gaps in the learning. And when we give that feedback, it's got to be high quality. We can't just say well done or good for you. We really need to think about what we're telling the children that will help them do better in the future. Which means we ought to plan how the feedback will be delivered, received, and then that we monitor that the children do something with it. Otherwise, it's just us talking to them for no reason. We ought to carefully consider how to use purposeful and time-efficient written feedback. What we mean by this is that teachers shouldn't be writing pages of feedback that's never used. It should be something that students are going to use without us having additional workload issues. And that means that number 5 here, verbal feedback may be more time efficient. And in fact, the manner of the feedback is less than important than ensuring it's of high quality. So thinking about high quality feedback, imagine that this is written in Charlie's book. Which bit of this feedback do you think Charlie's going to focus on? Just have a little moment to read through this and see what you think. So we know that whatever kind of feedback we give to children, they tend to focus in on a grade really, rather than anything that we've written or told them about how to improve their work. So we need to think about that. Now, when we think about types of feedback, the 4 main ones that I've put down here are written, oral, peer and self. Written feedback has the advantage that there's a clear record that pupils can go back to. However, it can be a high workload for teachers, and if we don't use it properly and the student doesn't engage, then it's also a waste of all that work we've done. Oral feedback is really quick, very easy. You can clarify the child has understood you, and it means that pupils tend to engage more. But there isn't a record, so the pupil might forget what was said, so just bear that in mind. Peer feedback is when we get students to feedback to each other, which can be really powerful. The pupils tend to engage on a much deeper level, and they get to see other examples of work and think about where they've done better or worse than themselves. One of the disadvantages are sometimes students can be over kind, but they could also be over harsh and mark each other down quite a lot. So we just need to be aware that if it's important, we need to then check that marking, which is more workload. And then self-feedback is obviously a lot less exposing than showing your work to somebody else, and pupils can add their own comments and therefore personalise their learning. What we have to be careful of is that the pupils are actually honest with themselves, which most I think are, but also that misconceptions might remain if we don't pick them up. So some tips to make your feedback effective: avoid the pupil focusing on the grade, not the feedback. Harder in a test or an exam, but just give some thought to that. Make sure that the pupil knows how to improve, not just that they got something wrong. Try and reference a particular skill or a specific piece of knowledge. Keep those targets really small, a little bit like when we're trying to give you targets as trainees. You want to make sure that your targets are equally specific for children. Include positive feedback. Tell children where they did well so they know to do it again. And then make sure that pupils have a chance to actively engage with the feedback, whether that's doing corrections or having a discussion. It doesn't really matter, but you need to make sure that that feedback has some kind of impact. And make sure that whatever you do, it's going to motivate and challenge, and just not make them sad and depressed because they haven't done very well. Think about that too. So the next section of the presentation is just going to go through some strategies for effective assessment and feedback. So have a quick look through some of these and see what you find interesting or useful. Starting with questioning then, it is quite good practice to consider planning questions for your lessons. Not all necessarily, but some of the really key ones. These could be closed or open. You'll have met these already, but closed questions will have a very specific response. They often start with things like what, where, when, who. They're good for recalling factual information, but they only provide quite limited information and insight, so to be used sparingly and in the right place. Open questions have lots of potential responses, which means they're more likely to promote thinking. They often start with the sort of why and how, and they're very good for checking understanding. And of course, you can then ask more detailed questions to follow on once you've got the initial response from a student. So in your view, just have a little think before you move on about your gut reaction and which ones you think will be more effective. While we're looking at questioning, I will take a moment to look at multiple choice questions. A lot of people sort of dismiss these because they see them as closed and therefore of limited value. And in a sense, that's right, because there was only one correct answer. But well written, you can get your students to show really deep understanding, and they're great for pulling out particular misconceptions. So I'll have a look at a couple of examples. So here's one from MFL. There are 4 translations for the red building. And if we look at the 4 options here, the student has to know the correct word for the, they need to know the correct adjective ending for red, and they also need to spot that you need to have a capital for the beginning of the noun. So although this looks like it's quite a simple question, there's quite a lot of information and knowledge needed to get that right. And by the way, the correct answer is C. This is an example from physics, and traditionally a lot of these sorts of questions used to be included in physics A-level papers. So here the students are asked to pick the graph showing when a ball is thrown vertically up and then where it returned. So again, they need to know quite a lot here because they've got to understand the physics of projectiles, and then they've got to be able to apply it to a graph. So again, a very complicated piece of work to get one answer. Hinge questions then. A hinge question or hinge point in a lesson is where a teacher needs to check that the students have got a key concept and are ready to move on. These need to be planned in advance. It's difficult to do these on the hoof really. So a hinge question would normally be multiple choice, which is why I think they need a little bit of planning. Every student should be able to respond. So whether this is using some kind of voting system, mini whiteboards, hands up, hands down, whatever it is you're going to do, it's got to be something every child does. The idea is it should check understanding. Think about the examples I've just shown you. And it should tell the teacher whether they are able to move on or whether there's anything they need to go over first. Hinge questions, although they are multiple choice and will have one particular answer, can be followed up with discussion, such as explain why that answer is correct. So here's an example from earlier on in the presentation Which of these is not true about formative assessment? I've put 4 options here, and we would normally then look at who got it right, who got it wrong, what made you choose that answer, so I can take the discussion a lot further even from one multiple choice question. And as you can see here, you need quite a lot of reading and understanding even just to separate out the 4 different points. So they can be quite sophisticated questions. A nice quick strategy you'll have come across already in your teaching placements, but think, pair, share. This is where we ask students to think about what their answer will be, and we give them a time limit, discuss the answer with their partners, that's the pairing, and then we go and share with the class. It does mean as a teacher, if you've given children time to think, you should be able to go to any child or any pair in the class and they should be able to give you an answer. Another common strategy is the pose, pause, pounce, bounce. It starts with posing the question, obviously, and then the most important bit is the pause. You do need to give children a chance to think of their answer. We are terrible as teachers at filling silences. So at this point, we really do need to tell ourselves quite sharply to shut up now and give the children a chance to think. Then we pounce, not literally on a child, for an answer. And if they can't do it, or if you think they haven't quite completed, we then bounce to another child. So we might say that answer's not quite there yet. Can so-and-so help? So pose, pause, pounce, bounce. And again, when we're questioning, we do need to try and cover the class, otherwise we only really know what a few keen students are able to do. So anything that enables you to select students randomly is really useful. There are some really nice online and PowerPoint selectors that you can embed into your own presentations. Some people use lollipop sticks where each stick has a child's name on and you take one at random, or you could just stab your register. But whatever it is you do, the more, if it's random, then students know that they might be asked, so they should all be paying attention. Use of mini whiteboards is a big favourite of mine because, again, this involves every single child in the class. So you could use a mini whiteboard for children to write answers on and show you. You could get them to vote or do a multiple choice answer where they put a letter or number up, or you can even just use it to say whether or not they think that they understand, don't understand, somewhere in the middle. So you could use smiley faces, frowny faces, whatever it is you think is useful. One bit of advice I would always give is never let the children put the boards up until you tell them, otherwise obviously they just copy each other's answers. So normally I tell them not to show, and then I give them a 3, 2, 1 countdown, show your boards. And then some really short, sharp ways that you can check understanding or how students feel about their learning. You could use traffic lights. So some people actually give them red, amber and green cards. There are some schools with planners with these in the back, and students just say whether or not they haven't got a clue, are sort of there, or really understand it. Thumbs up, thumbs down, or a continuum. You can actually get students to line up across your classroom and say, well, I do agree, or I don't agree, or I'm somewhere in the middle. There are various forms of what we call entrance or exit tickets. You could ask pupils a question at the start of the lesson and they put their answer on a piece of paper. Teachers can then check the answers, perhaps while the children are doing their first activity, and then use them to inform their teaching. Or the pupils and teacher can compare their understanding at the end of the lesson. So this is what you thought at the start, what do we think at the end? And exit tickets are a similar idea. You could get students to write something on a piece of paper before they leave and use that to assess their understanding at the end of the lesson. A couple of these techniques here are part assessment but part getting students to engage in their own learning as well. So I think these are particularly useful not just at the end of a lesson, but sometimes if I'm using something like a video, text or other source, I want to make sure that the students are engaging with it during the lesson and not just sort of drifting off. So you could ask them 3, 2, 1, 3 things you didn't know, 2 things that surprised you, and 1 thing you want to start doing with what you've learned. I've also used a grid a little bit on the right hand side there, something you already knew, something new, something that surprised you, and a question you want to ask. I particularly like the questions because that can inform your future teaching, and actually I've used that to plan a whole different lesson based on the questions that students have asked me in the past. There's quite a high chance you'll find something like this in amongst written feedback within your departments in school at the moment. So a lot of people refer to WWWEBI, what went well, even better if. And so the idea is that we've got some positive feedback and then a piece of what to do next. It avoids negative feedback, but also helps the teacher really pinpoint something very specific the student can target, as we mentioned earlier. Some schools I've also seen use things like 2 stars and a wish, but this sort of thing features quite regularly in written feedback. One other technique you might see are rubrics. I've seen these used really effectively in humanities, and you can even set these up online so that you can mark Teams work, for example, electronically, so they're very useful. The idea is that we're telling the student in advance what we're marking for and what they need to do to get each mark. So it's a bit like giving a child a mark scheme so they know what they've got to do well. And again, this is a little bit about taking that mystery away for students. So in this example, I wanted a poster about protecting hearing, but I had 3 very clear strands I wanted students to think about. One was their scientific knowledge, so they had to show they understood the ear and how it could be damaged. The other one was application of that knowledge, in this case to how we protect our hearing. And then thirdly, I'd put in a literacy and presentation target because I wanted them to understand that we have to be able to communicate science information to others. So in this case, the child will get a mark for each of those 3 strands, but really they should almost be able to mark their own work once they've completed it. So the final technique that I'm going to have a look at in this presentation is the use of highlighting. And this is really quick to do, and the results stand out really easily because they're different colours. So the first example there on assessing understanding is where I've asked students to highlight where the writing is descriptive and where it's critical in another. And in this example, they would therefore go through and they would highlight where they thought was descriptive, where they thought was critical. And when I take that work in, I can instantly see if they've got it right. The second example on the right there is self-assessment, and this is where a child has written a piece of work and handed it in, but then I've asked them to take hold of it and they've got to say where they think they've made a point, where they think they've explained something, where they've got evidence and where they've justified what they've said. Now for a student, if they realise that they haven't put any purple in or any blue in, for example, then they can see instantly what they've missed from their answer. So really quick and effective way of assessing. So that's the end of the presentation. It's a quick run through assessment and feedback. So I hope you found it useful.